You're listening to Project Management Paradise, the ultimate project management podcast.
Hello again and welcome to Project Management Paradise. Johnny Byrne here, and this podcast delivers real project management insights from experts around the world. In this episode, I speak with Cheryl Hartmann about the importance of change management when it comes to project management. Cheryl has over 18 years' experience in change management and has worked with large corporations such as GE and CSC, and now runs her own consultancy company called Cambiar Consulting. Hello, Cheryl.
Hello, Johnny.
I don't know whether to say good morning, good evening, or good night based on your originally where you're from, where you're living, and then me based in Ireland. But I think it's 11 a.m., is it?
It is. It's definitely morning here and the same day, which is more than can be said for where I'm from in Australia.
So can you tell me a little bit about your background then?
Yeah, well, first of all, Johnny, thanks very much and for having me here today. And it's a pleasure to be able to chat a little today about change management. So as we've just discussed, I'm actually today located in the US on the East Coast, but formerly I'm from Australia. Educational-wise, Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration, worked for many years for various companies, large and small, in Australia, but also lots of US multinationals in different roles. So roles like IT recruitment, Six Sigma Black Belt, business excellence, strategic program management, and also org change management. About 8 years ago, maybe not quite 8 years ago, we actually moved to the US, and we're now located in Northern Virginia, which is about 30 minutes outside Washington, D.C. Have a lot of friends who joke to us that we've just really traded one capital city for another. But since moving here, I've actually worked full-time, and then about 2.5 years ago, decided to go consulting and start working for myself. So that's where we are today. The reason behind my consulting was I just reached a point, I think, where I wanted to have a little more flexibility and control around my life and about work-life balance. So I think for any of your listeners who have lived abroad and have family, let's just say back home, you'll appreciate the juggle that sometimes you're faced with having to spend enough time in both places. So this way it was something I could do that actually lets me work and still be involved that way, but also take a little time out when I need to. Just get some travel under my belt and, more importantly, spend time with family and friends. And
how did you become involved in change management then?
Looking back, my first involvement with change management was when I was probably working as a Six Sigma Black Belt. But at the time, I didn't actually realise that. I had a title that was called Six Sigma Black Belt. And didn't really think about doing change management because, as you know, Six Sigma is a process improvement methodology. So what I had was a whole lot of sets of tools to defining process change, tools for looking at statistical regression and ways to measure everything. And we also had a lot of tools dealing with people. And I have to say that would have been the first time that I thought about using tools and really looking at how people reacted to change. But over the years, I have to say I've always been drawn to that people side. So at GE, which is where I did my Six Sigma training, and what I didn't realise until I left was that their training actually had 3 components, where many other companies, when you do black belt training, only had 2. And the third component that GE had added, and I believe still do have, was a component called CAP, or Change Acceleration. I remember sitting in the course that week going, wow, this is just amazing. This all is common sense. It makes sense. And it was kind of like an epiphany that the people side of change to me was way more exciting than the statistical analysis or data analysis that you need to do when doing business process improvement. So in some regards, I guess that week of training when I was doing my black belt was actually had quite a profound impact on my career. So that was my first involvement without me even really being aware that that's where I was headed.
Was that your first change management role then, or did you move into formally into a change management role?
For quite a few years, I probably had hybrid roles. And again, back then, there weren't a lot of roles around that were pure OCM, or not in the companies I worked. Now, I basically worked for large IT system integrators. So there weren't a lot of people around in those organisations doing change management. The role that where I would say was mostly change management was for a large multinational in Australia, and they were starting out on a transformation effort that was organisational wide. It was strategic and it needed to be done because the way we were doing things in the company needed to change. The goal of the company transformation was obviously increased profitability, but the last part of that sentence was by becoming more customer-centric. Now, that in itself doesn't sound very radical or different to many other company goals. However, the key difference wasn't so much the words and the outcome, it was actually how and what we were going to focus on that made this quite different and quite exciting. So we were absolutely going to focus on changing processes and systems, but the very large component of this transformation was going to be focusing on the people side of the organisation. And that area of the organisation had been mostly ignored in the past because it was always too hard. So the scope of what we were doing was looking at how we actually worked together, how we dealt with change, and probably most importantly, how we actually led our people in our teams. And it was to start at the top of the organisation. So my role in that was to set up and lead the strategic program office to make sure that the initiatives were delivered effectively. And I choose that word effectively pretty deliberate, and because it wasn't just about projects delivering on time and budget, and that's important, but it was also pretty important to drive sustainable change, or change that was going to stick. We were spending a lot of money on this, and the ROI was front and centre for the CEO and the CFOs. And just an aside, the CFO was my boss at the time. So this wasn't about just making people feel good. It was really linked to business strategy and really a project that needed to deliver. So long story short, Johnny, I found that very quickly my role wasn't really about leading project managers in the strategic program office. It wasn't about spending time looking at project plans, but my role was pretty much spending time with senior leaders who were sponsors of the projects that were underway, leaders of each of the change initiatives who were managing at a project level, or basically doing a lot of what we term today stakeholder management.
And for our listeners who may not know exactly what change management is, can you explain it to us briefly in your own words?
Yes, just a little aside. It's a good question because everyone has a different opinion on what actually change management is. As I mentioned, I used to work for the global IT systems integrator, and one day I was speaking to one of the IT project managers about his project and how we needed to introduce and do some activities around change management. And his response to me was, why are you talking about change management? We have a whole area of business dealing with change and config management for IT changes. That's not your area. So after that, I had to I've come to use the term organisational change management because I've spent way too long in IT companies and have learnt that it can have different meanings. So OCM, org change management, is probably what you'll hear me call it. So to answer your question, my definition is pretty simple. It's really project management for people. And while that may sound simplistic, Johnny, but if you're asking someone to do something different, you're going to get a different response or reaction from each individual to that change. And that's basically because you're dealing with people. And everyone's reaction to a request to do something different is based on a person's experience or culture or value or emotions. So while it might be really easy to manage a one-on-one interaction with someone, if you're asking them to do something simple like, could you wear your watch on your other arm for the next month? You, if you are there with them, can monitor that on a day-to-day basis and make changes and give reminders to what you need to do. But if you're implementing an ERP system for 1,000 people across different geographies, it now becomes impossible to do that one-on-one interaction. Basically, all change management is about managing people's reactions, and it's about using different tools and techniques to mitigate negative responses. But when people are impacted by change, they'll basically fall into three groups. It'll be those that are very positive and will get on board very early, or those that will sit on the fence and say they're going to wait and see whether the change works, or those that actually will never come to terms with the required change. Regardless of which group of people the individuals fall into, they will all show resistance to change. Some of it fleetingly, others quite for a long time. So if you don't manage that, you actually will take longer to deliver what you need to do. So to do all that, enter OCM, or all change management, which basically is a set of principles or processes, depending on the methodology you use, and also a set of tools for managing people's responses to the change. And that, as you can see, is not that different from project management. It's just that you're using and managing people.
It's not a case of, updating somebody's job description. Then you need to obviously manage people's reaction to that change. Do you have an example of some of the methodologies you use?
Yes. Well, I've been certified in 3 different ones, and they over the years. So obviously, first of all, I mentioned the one that I did with GE as Six Sigma, and that was the CAP process, the change acceleration process. The second methodology, which is also US-based, was called Accelerated Implementation Methodology, or AIM. And the third one that I've done since moving here was ProSci and ProSci's model of ADCAR. So what I've actually found, though, Johnny, it doesn't really matter what methodology you use. It doesn't matter whether it's those 3 or it's Kotter's 8-step process. What all of them provide is a set of principles and processes, together with tools to manage change from people perspective. But the real benefit of having been, had the opportunity to work and use different methodologies, that you have a set of very robust tools that are, some are very similar, some are different, and you can manage then according to what the issue is that you're seeing. I don't believe there's a right or wrong choice on an OCM methodology. It's more about using something to manage the change to achieve the outcome that you want.
And how soon do you know, and I know it's probably on a per case basis, but how soon do you actually see that you have effective implementation of a good change management method?
Yeah, I used the word effective earlier, and there's probably a reason that I've used effective rather than just say successful implementation. A lot of projects, and I'm not going to say all, but many projects' measure of success are often just on time or on budget. And very, very few projects actually talk about whether the business and human objectives have actually been met. And actually, to be frank, many projects don't even list human and business side objectives. In one of the methodologies, the one I just talked about, AIM, they have 2 measures that they talk about in their definition, which would be called installation, not implementation. And they are on time and on budget. And don't get me wrong, you actually need those. So an example of in AIM speak would be of an installation will be where you have installed the system but no one is using it. But the project team has met its objectives. It's considered to have been successful because they delivered the system in the time frame and they came in on or under budget. Now, implementation, again, in using the AIM definition, would be considered if the project a success if the project was on time and on budget, and you also delivered the business goals, which might be strategic advantage or increased revenue. Also, the technical goals. Now, the system might needed to be seamless integration with other systems or it's easy to use. And also the human objectives, which may have been 100% staff utilising the system or an increase in productivity. Really, the words and labels are not important here, but what is important is the reason why effectiveness, in my view, needs to be considered a key outcome of success On time and on budget, plus meeting business, technical and human objectives, all need to be considered, because I believe they are all linked to the organisation's bottom line, which is around ROI. And the impacts that you have, the factors that impact the ROI of an organisation and how the organisation gets overall effective implementation is by managing employees' resistance to change, is by identifying and mitigating negative reactions to change, and it's linking the change management effort and the project effort to the business results. So it's not really about managing, org change is not really about just managing to make people feel good about the change. It really is bottom line driven of the organisation. It's about managing the impact and how you manage the project. It's about you will impact ROI if you manage the people side of the change, because if it takes people a long time to actually pick up the change, become fully utilised, to actually start performing at a higher level, it impacts, those three are actually impacting the potential ROI of the project for the company and the company's bottom line.
Is it about keeping people happy then, or?
No. No, although many people would actually think that, and you'll often hear people say, oh, we don't need consultants to do that warm, fuzzy stuff. Sometimes people will actually say, oh, we just need a comms plan or a communications plan, and we just need, maybe even a training plan. And there's nothing wrong with training and communication plans, and you actually need them, and they're key strategies of any organisational change management plan. However, it's not about making people feel good about the change. It really is about the organisation achieving its return on investment as quickly as possible. Or put another way, delivering the benefits that the project identified in the initial business case. So speed of adoption, utilisation and proficiency have all been found through ProSci, which is a research company in change management, as the three key human factors that impact an organisation's ROI. Because if productivity is not achieved as soon as possible and it takes people longer to buy in and to use the system or process effectively or to understand their new role, time then is a cost to the organisation, and their return on investment will continue to be impacted. So really it's about getting people to understand the change from their perspective, why the change is required, and to get their buy-in as soon as possible and get them up to speed, all because the company is doing this for a business reason and it impacts their bottom line the longer the program takes.
I guess when organisations change software that they use, is that a regular time for the need for change management, or?
So I actually think regardless of the project, whether it's a ERP installation, whether it's a process change, new processes, whether it's a merger and acquisition, whether it's a reorganisation, I would use and have org change management involved early, and I'd always have them involved right up front with the project team. I think I mentioned earlier that people believe that sometimes org change management is really just comms plan, or we don't need a lead. So as people realise that OCM is very much around doing assessments and assessing the impact of the change that you're requesting people, tailoring communications, training plans, building plans that manage people's resistance and negative reactions to change, and then reinforcing those change are all activities that OCM can do. And the reason that we would do those would be to expedite or accelerate the effectiveness of the implementation. It's not meant to get in the way of delivering the technical system. I think they go hand in hand. Again, it's very much, in my view, the three key elements of any successful project implementation would be organisational leadership, project management, and change management, or OCM. So I guess I want to stress here, though, Johnny, that OCM is not, I'm not advocating here a one-size-fits-all for OCM. part of any OCM strategy or plan would be that initial assessment of how large the impact is to those involved and then developing a plan that's fit for size. It's about doing that initial assessment up front and having the discussions as part of the team. OCM can be scaled in all the methodologies. It's scalable and no two projects are the same. So you actually need to look at what sort of project, what are we asking people to do differently, and certainly then working out a plan that fits for that particular implementation. But I really believe that OCM should be viewed just as importantly as project management and that they be integrated.
Sure. That leads me on to my next question then, is when should change management be used in a project?
Right up front. Biggest challenge at the beginning is understanding who is being impacted and the degree that they will be impacted or asked to do something different. So having a communications plan isn't going to work for that. So having an assessment of how that actually works, it shapes everything that you do. I've got a really good example of that, Johnny, actually. I worked on back in Australia, the organisation was about 4,000 people and we were doing a financial ERP implementation. Timeframe was about 9 months and tight, and the go live date was fixed. It was day one of the new financial year. There was a specialist technical team flown in from Germany, and that was part of the company I was working for. And then the program director was a finance lead, very capable and senior finance lead. Plus we have various other people on the team from financial analysts, contractors and things like that. The CFO, who was my boss at the time, actually requested the OCM team to engage at the beginning of the program. So we had OCM. We also put under that banner of the OCM team communications, training and process. And my program director of the ERP project immediately pushed back. He just said, we don't need you involved now. We don't need comms and training people this early. You know, we're not doing major process improvement. We're just going to be revising project processes. And look, it's all about the costs. Remember, this is a finance implementation and we needed to manage the costs. However, the CFO, who was the key sponsor of the project, remained pretty firm. He said, nope, we're actually doing this. And very quickly, this project in itself could be a case study, but it's probably one of the better projects I've worked at because, as you can appreciate, Johnny, no project is perfect and no project. I probably have more examples of how things didn't work well than worked well. So I'm really happy to share this one. But up front, in the planning stage, we actually did the assessments on the organisation and we did assessments on what else was happening in the organisation at the time. Again, the project director was saying, well, why are you doing that? We know what we need to do. And one of the things that people don't consider is what else is happening in the business. Resources for any project, particularly internal projects, are always scarce. So we needed to make sure, because the deadline was not movable, that this team and other projects that were going on in the business were not competing for the same people. If you don't have the resources, then the project will take longer to deliver. And if something's going to take longer to deliver, again, you're actually linking this back to the ROI of the overall program and why we're doing this. We did discover that other divisions had projects underway and eventually the steering committee had to be involved and lots of projects were reprioritised. We also had to assess in that initial assessment key stakeholder groups. Were the groups of people that were mostly impacted with the ERP implementation also being impacted by other things that were going on? Again, we needed a clear shot at these people if we were to meet the time frame. So prioritisation, initial assessments, understanding the history of implementation in that company, anything that we can find out were potential barriers to effective implementation were all needed. So that was one of the key things that we did right up front. The other thing we did was obviously identified the key stakeholder groups and then assess the impact on them. So the company was 4,000 people. It was going to impact everyone in the organisation, but what we showed very, very quickly, and people knew this intuitively, so don't get me wrong, this wasn't all rocket science and new to people, but we knew that there were probably only 200 to 250 people in two different functional groups that were actually going to have their day-to-day activities change radically. So very quickly, again, by doing those assessments, actually pulling out the information, putting it together in a way that actually became very clear, we were actually able to tailor and work out how we were going to engage those particular groups of people particularly. We were actually able to tailor training plans very quickly because those impacted the most would actually need more training, but those that were just going to, enter their timesheet, we could do things differently. So we developed engagement plans. So as the project got underway, the two most impacted groups, which were finance and the project management teams, interestingly enough, we actually ran focus groups on them. We surfaced what their concerns were. We actually took on board their ideas, but more importantly, we actually got them involved. We assigned people to help the solution team. We put people on the testing team. We got other people involved in, changing or updating and reviewing business processes. And we were able to use others as communications to be champions of the project back in the areas. And again, why did we do this? This was about getting them involved so that they had ownership or some skin in the game, I guess, or ownership of the solution. It's, as you probably know, it's pretty hard to be negative about a change if you were actually involved in the solution and implementation. And again, all of this wasn't done to make them feel good. Of course we wanted their buy-in. Of course we wanted them to accept the change. But again, this was done to accelerate implementation and remove some of the negative reactions and remove and manage and I guess mitigate potential barriers to implementation further down the track.
Are you looking at days or potentially weeks in terms of speeding up the implementation and execution process?
Well, I think at the time it was tight anyway, and as I mentioned on this particular project, the end date wasn't moving, or they didn't want it to move because it was the beginning of a new financial year. All of this is, I think, probably very hard to quantify. How many days did we save? How many days did we, or weeks did we shave off doing things? And that's one of the hardest things to be able to quantify because you're basically dealing with people and people's emotions. Sometimes resistance to change, all the time resistance to change. I'm not sure it's rational and I don't know that it's logical. And I think there's a Dale Carnegie quote that goes something along the lines of, when dealing with people, remember you are not dealing with creatures of logic, but creatures of emotion. So it's very hard to quantify how much or time did we save by having the project managers involved or a subset of the project management stakeholder group involved. I've never quantified that, but what I can say is we did hit the deadline with a lot of people's effort on the technical side as well as OCM side. The technical specialist team who came in from Germany had not had OCM involved as much as we had been involved, whether it was doing testing by process, not just by module or function, by having the different levels of training, self-service and different things like that. They had not seen that before and they took away kind of going, okay, maybe we need to think about further implementations. I think the biggest vote of success came from the program director right at the end. And remember, he was pretty sceptical right at the beginning of not needing us and just getting comms involved a bit later down the track. But he, at the wind down celebration, the project close celebration, actually stood up publicly and thanked and singled out the OCM team. He said that while he'd been pretty sceptical at the beginning, he knew that technically they could hit the deadline. They could actually install the system and get it up and running. But he didn't think that day one, week one, would have gone anywhere near as smoothly as if the OCM team had not been involved. And what we're talking about there again is not making people feel good. But as of day one of that new financial year, we're talking about people were able to record their time, project managers were able to enter the cost for work and projects delivered, and the finance team could actually invoice the customers. So they're pretty big items that you need as a business to keep going. Now, did it all go perfectly? No. Were there issues? Absolutely. But the business kept going. We didn't grind to the halt and they didn't move the day. So I was pretty proud to be part of that team. I mean, I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that that's the only reason that that project was successful. But I think if I had to take away the highlights, I think OCM lets you tailor a response. It lets you know who you're dealing with. It lets you manage people's reactions. And again, the only reason that you're doing this is that you want to accelerate and remove all barriers of implementation so that you can have that return on investment as soon as possible.
And just as we wind up then, could you share with our listeners just what is the biggest lesson you might have learned from all your experience to date?
There's so many, Johnny, so many. It's one of the beauties of working with people. You think you've seen it all, but they can always surprise you. But really, I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that leadership, or in OCM speak, sponsorship, is so vitally important. You've got to take it seriously. I've seen firsthand how important this is. Now, what I'm talking about is ownership of or commitment from it could be executive sponsors or whatever the appropriate level is in the business, of the leader who owns the project. I've seen examples and have been involved in projects where we've actually flagged at the very beginning of the project that there was a lack of leader buy-in. And then we've talked ourselves out of it. We've talked around it. Look, we really don't think, Bob or Mary are on board. They're saying the right things, but their actions, we can't get a meeting on their diary. We can't get them to do a presentation on the project. There's a major problem. And what actually happened, we ignored it. We actually talked ourselves out of it. We said, no, we can get this sorted. We can bring them on board. But it did come back to bite us, and the project actually stalled. We ended up we ended up working through the issues, but a lot of time was wasted and a lot of effort had to be applied to actually resolve the issues. And actually in that one case, we actually had to replace the sponsor. But it's that important. People take their cues. They want to hear from their managers what this change means. So if you work back up through the organisation, you need to find these correct sponsorship and sponsor that's actually going to say the right things, is actually going to demonstrate the right behaviours, giving priorities to meetings, to actually doing what he needs to do, not just saying, and I think the term that most of your listeners will be familiar with is walking the talk. So that's all very important. But the third thing to get sustainable change, that change that's going to stick, is really you need the sponsor to reinforce the behaviours of what the future state looks like. So for me, sponsorship, it's just that critical. And in some cases, I've actually heard it's 40%, give or take. The most critical factor on a project is the executive sponsorship. So I can't stress enough, you've got to have the right level of sponsorship and leadership in any program, as large or small. Doesn't have to be executive level. It needs to be at the right level for the program that you're doing or the change that you're working on. And you've just got to have it. I've lived the pain of thinking we could fix it. And I guess the other one small thing that I'll leave on this is don't assume that everyone gets this soft stuff, as many people call the people side of change. I think there's a quote somewhere back in my days, and I want to say it probably came back at GE, but it stayed with me a long, long time, that kind of talks about the hard stuff is the easy stuff and the soft stuff is the hard stuff. So, and that's still true today.
Well, look, thanks very much for all those great insights and examples, Cheryl. Where can people find out more about you?
I have a LinkedIn page, and watch this space for a website for our consulting company of Cambiar Consulting.
Well, look, I'll include it in the show notes, and thanks again for taking the time and for taking our call here on the Project Management Paradise podcast.
Thanks, Johnny. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Wow, there was a lot of great information in that interview, so thanks again, Cheryl. You will find a link to Cheryl's LinkedIn profile in the show notes at projectmanagementparadise.com/2. We'd also love an honest review and welcome feedback about this podcast at the same link. That's projectmanagementparadise.com/2. Thanks again for listening, and tune in again next week for another great guest.
Thanks for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast at projectmanagementparadise.com.